Story: Shadows of a Sister.
The smell of old paper is something you never truly forget. It is a scent that sits somewhere between vanilla, almond, and deep, dry earth. For most people, it is just the smell of a library or a forgotten attic. But for me, Genevieve, it was the scent of my livelihood, and lately, the scent of my salvation. I had been hired as a private archivist for the Blackwood estate, a job that felt less like a career move and more like stepping into a Gothic novel. The pay was exorbitant, suspiciously so, and the requirements were oddly specific. They didn't want a team, they wanted one person, discreet, unmarried, willing to live on the premises for 3 months without visitors. At 38, with a mountain of debt from my failed art gallery and a life that felt like it was fraying at the edges, I didn't have the luxury of asking too many questions. The estate was located 3 hours north of the city, hidden behind a perimeter of dense weeping willows and iron gates that groaned in protest when I arrived. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity, beautiful in a melancholic way, with turrets that pierced the gray sky and windows that looked like heavy-lidded eyes watching my arrival. I remember stepping out of my small, battered sedan and feeling the temperature drop. It wasn't just the autumn chill, it was something emanating from the stone itself. The heavy oak door opened before I could even reach for the knocker. A woman stood there. She was tall, impossibly thin, dressed in a charcoal silk blouse and wide-legged trousers that whispered when she moved. Her hair was a striking shade of silver, pulled back into a severe chignon that pulled her skin tight against her high cheekbones. "Genevieve," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was like cracking ice, sharp, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood, it's a pleasure to meet you," I said, extending a hand that felt clumsy and rough compared to her porcelain stillness. "Miss Blackwood," she corrected, ignoring my hand. "Please, come in. Beatrice will take your bags. We have much to discuss, and I do not like to waste daylight." I followed her into the foyer. The floor was checkered black and white marble, stretching out like a chessboard. A grand staircase swept upward, disappearing into the shadows of the second floor. The air inside was still, heavy with that scent I knew so well: dust, wax, and time. "Your task is simple, yet demanding, Miss Blackwood," Cordelia, as I would later learn to call her in the privacy of my own mind, said as she led me into a drawing room that felt more like a museum than a living space. She gestured for me to sit on a velvet armchair that looked too expensive to touch. "My family has occupied this estate for 6 generations," she continued, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace, where a low fire sputtered. "My father, the late Archibald Blackwood, was a hoarder of history, letters, deeds, contracts, diaries, photographs. They are stored in the West Wing Library. It is a chaotic mess. I need it organized, cataloged, digitized." "I understand," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I specialize in restoration and organization of 19th and 20th century correspondence. I assure you, I treat every document with the utmost care." Cordelia stopped pacing. She turned to me, and for the first time, I saw her eyes clearly. They were pale blue, almost transparent, and filled with a frantic, vibrating intensity that unsettled me. "It is not just about care, Genevieve," she said softly, leaning in. "It is about discretion. Every family has complexities, things that are written in moments of passion or anger. I need to know that whatever you find in that library stays in that library. You are to organize, not to judge, and certainly not to share." "I signed the non-disclosure agreement, Miss Blackwood," I replied, meeting her gaze. My professional reputation is built on silence. She studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment. It felt as though she was peeling back the layers of my skin, checking to see if I was rot or solid wood underneath. Finally, she nodded. Good. Beatrice will show you to your room. Dinner is served at 7 sharp. I do not tolerate lateness. The first 2 weeks were a blur of dust and solitude. The West Wing library was magnificent and terrifying. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound books, and in the center of the room stood 3 massive oak tables piled high with boxes. It was a chaotic sea of paper. There were tax records from 1920 mixed with love letters from 1890. There were blueprints for expansions of the house that were never built, and receipts for jewelry that cost more than my entire education. My routine was rigid. I woke at 6, breakfasted alone in the small morning room, and worked until 1. Lunch was a sandwich brought by Beatrice, the housekeeper, a woman of few words and heavy footsteps, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Then I worked until 6, dressed for dinner, and ate with Cordelia at the long mahogany table that could have seated 20 people. Our dinners were strange, theatrical performances. "Did you make progress today?" Cordelia asked one evening, cutting into her steak with surgical precision. The only sound in the room was the clinking of silver against china and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Yes," I replied, taking a sip of water. "I have finished sorting the correspondence from the 1940s, mostly business transactions regarding the textile mills." "The mills were the source of our wealth," Cordelia said, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece of dying white roses. "And our misery. My father spent more time there than he did in this house." "I found some letters from him to your mother," I ventured carefully. "They seemed distant." Cordelia's knife screeched against the plate. She froze, her knuckles turning white around the handle. "My parents had a complicated arrangement," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Affection was not a currency traded openly in this house. My mother, Gwendolyn, was a fragile creature. The world was too loud for her. She spent her final years in the solarium, painting watercolors that didn't exist." She looked up at me, her expression challenging. "You will find, Genevieve, that the written word is often a mask. People write who they wish they were, not who they are. Do not believe everything you read in those boxes." I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. Of course. But as the days turned into weeks, it became impossible not to read between the lines. The archives were telling a story, a narrative that was slowly taking shape like a photograph developing in a darkroom. I started noticing discrepancies in the timeline. It began with a series of photographs from 1955. They were black and white, slightly grainy, depicting a summer garden party. In the center sat Gwendolyn Blackwood, looking ethereal and sad. Standing next to her were 2 little girls. They looked to be about 5 or 6 years old. Identical dresses, identical ribbons in their hair. I frowned, holding the photograph under the magnifying lamp. I had studied the family tree Cordelia had provided. It listed only one child, Cordelia Blackwood, born 1949. I assumed it was a cousin or perhaps a friend of the family. But as I dug deeper into the box labeled 1950-1960, I found more. Birthday cards addressed to "My Darlings," receipts for 2 sets of piano lessons, 2 sets of riding boots. "Beatrice," I said the next day when the housekeeper brought my lunch. I tried to sound casual, pretending to be focused on a ledger. "Did Miss Cordelia have a sister? Or a close cousin who lived here?" Beatrice froze. The tray in her hands rattled slightly. She was a sturdy woman with a face like a dried apple, lined and tough. She looked at the door, then back at me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We don't talk about the other one," she said. My heart skipped a beat. The other one? Who? Beatrice took a step closer, her eyes wide with a fear I hadn't expected. "Miss Genevieve, you seem like a nice woman. You do your work, you keep your head down. Keep doing that. Don't go digging in the garden where the weeds are too thick. Miss Cordelia, she has her ways. And the past in this house, it doesn't like to be disturbed." She turned and hurried out of the library, leaving me with a cold sandwich and a burning curiosity. The turning point came in the 4th week. The weather had turned violent. A storm had been battering the estate for 2 days, shaking the window panes and making the lights flicker. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Cordelia had been claiming migraines and hadn't come down for dinner in 3 nights. I was working late, the wind howling outside like a wounded animal. I was sorting through a heavy, iron-bound trunk that had been pushed into the deepest corner of the library. It was locked, but the wood around the latch was rotted. With a gentle pry of my letter opener, the lock gave way. Inside, the smell was different. Not just old paper, but something sweeter, cloying, dried lavender. The trunk was filled with dresses, child's dresses, but underneath the fabric, there was a stack of journals. They were bound in red leather, the edges worn from handling. I opened the first one. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. October 14th, 1965. She hates me. I know she does. Father looks at me and sees a mistake. But Cordelia looks at me and sees a thief. She says I stole her face. She says there isn't enough room in this world for 2 of us. Why did Mother have to leave? Why am I the one who has to stay in the shadows? I turned the pages, my breath catching in my throat. November 2nd, 1965. They are sending me away to that school in Switzerland. But Cordelia gets to stay. She gets the debutante ball, she gets the name. I am just the shadow, the echo, Serafina. Even my name sounds like a whisper. Serafina. There were twins, Cordelia and Serafina. I sat back, the journal heavy in my lap. Why hide a twin? In the 1950s, twins weren't a curse. Unless there was something else. I spent the next 3 hours devouring the journals. The story they told was one of intense, suffocating jealousy. Serafina was the spirited one, the wild one. Cordelia was the cold one, the perfect doll. Their father, Archibald, pitted them against each other, but clearly favored Cordelia's obedience. Then, the entries stopped abruptly in 1968. The last entry was chilling. December 24th, 1968. We had a fight on the cliffs. She told me I should never have been born. She said I was the sickness in the blood. I pushed her. I didn't mean to, but I pushed her. She fell. Oh God, she fell. I dropped the book. It hit the floor with a thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent library. My mind raced. Serafina pushed Cordelia? So Cordelia died? But Cordelia was upstairs, nursing a migraine? Unless... The thought was so absurd, so melodramatic, that I almost laughed. But then I remembered the photos. I remembered the coldness in Cordelia's eyes, the way she spoke of her mother with such distant observation. I needed proof. I needed to see something that wasn't written by a teenage girl in a diary. I began to search the trunk frantically. At the very bottom, beneath a moth-eaten velvet cape, I found a small wooden box. Inside was a medical report from a sanitarium in Switzerland, dated 1969. Patient, Serafina Blackwood. Diagnosis, severe dissociative identity disorder, trauma-induced amnesia, pathological lying. Notes: patient insists she is her deceased sister, Cordelia, refuses to answer to Serafina. Reconstruction of reality is absolute. I felt the blood drain from my face. The woman upstairs, the woman who had hired me, who ate dinner with me, who spoke of legacy with such reverence. She wasn't Cordelia. She was Serafina, the sister who had survived, the sister who had, in her guilt or madness, become the person she killed. A creak on the floorboards behind me made me jump. I spun around, clutching the medical report to my chest. Standing in the doorway of the library, illuminated by a flash of lightning from the storm outside, was Cordelia. She was wearing a long white nightgown, looking like a ghost from the very history I was unearthing. Her silver hair was loose, cascading down her back like a waterfall. "You found the red trunk," she said. Her voice was devoid of the imperious tone she usually used. It sounded younger, broken. I didn't mean to pry," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The lock, it was broken. She stepped into the room. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly, profoundly tired. "I told you, Genevieve," she whispered, walking slowly toward the center table. "I told you that the written word is a mask. I told you not to believe everything you read." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the tall windows. She stopped on the other side of the table, looking down at the scattered journals. She reached out a pale hand and touched the red leather cover with a tenderness that broke my heart. "Cordelia was perfect," she said softly. "She was the sun. I was just the moon, reflecting her light, cold, distant." She looked up at me. "Do you know what it's like to be the mistake? To be the spare heir? My father didn't want 2 daughters. He wanted a legacy. Cordelia was the legacy. I was the burden." "So you are Serafina?" I asked, taking a step back. She flinched at the name. It was a physical reaction, as if I had slapped her. "Serafina died a long time ago," she said, her voice hardening slightly. "She died on the cliffs that Christmas Eve. She was a foolish, jealous, wicked girl. She pushed her sister because she wanted, just for one moment, to be the one standing in the light." She walked around the table, closing the distance between us. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. "When I looked down, when I saw her body on the rocks," her voice cracked, tears welling in those pale eyes. "Something in me shattered. I couldn't be Serafina anymore. Serafina was a murderer. Serafina was a monster. So I left her there, and I became Cordelia." "And your parents?" I whispered. "They didn't know?" She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "My father knew. Of course he knew. He knew which daughter was the useful one and which was the wild one. But when I came back, when I walked into the house shivering and claiming to be Cordelia, claiming that Serafina had fallen, he looked at me. He looked me right in the eyes, and he chose to believe the lie, because it was better for the family name to lose the bad daughter and keep the good one, even if it meant living with a lie. He sent me away to Switzerland not to cure me," she continued, "but to train me, to make sure the transition was complete, to bury Serafina so deep she would never claw her way out again." She looked at the medical report in my hand. "But she tries," she whispered. "Sometimes, in the dark, she tries to scream." I looked at this woman, this wealthy, powerful, terrifying woman, and suddenly all I saw was a traumatized child who had been living a performance for 50 years. The luxury, the estate, the archives, it was all a stage set to maintain a delusion. "Why did you hire me?" I asked. "If you knew this was here, if you knew I might find it, why bring a stranger into this?" She slumped into one of the reading chairs, the silk of her nightgown pooling around her. "Because I am dying, Genevieve." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the thunder outside. "The doctors give me 6 months. Cancer. It's eating me from the inside, just like this secret has for decades." She looked at me with pleading eyes. "I have no children, no heirs. This house, this history, it will all be sold, scattered to the winds. I wanted someone to organize it, to make sense of it. But deep down, I think I wanted someone to know. I didn't want Serafina to vanish completely without ever being acknowledged. I wanted one person to know that she existed, that she suffered, that she was sorry." I stood there, holding the proof of her crime and her tragedy. I was a stranger, a paid employee. I could leave. I could take this story to the press. It would be a sensation. The mystery of Blackwood Manor. I could pay off my debts 10 times over. But as I looked at her, shivering in the chair, stripped of her armor, I realized that this wasn't a story about a crime. It was a story about survival, however twisted it had become. I slowly walked over to the fireplace. The embers were still glowing red hot. "Genevieve?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at the medical report. Then I looked at the journals. "You hired me to curate the history of the Blackwood family," I said, my voice steady, "to decide what is part of the legacy and what is not." I tossed the medical report into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and burst into flame. "No," she gasped, half rising from the chair. "Sit down," I said gently. I picked up the first journal. "Serafina deserves to be remembered, but not as a monster and not as a medical case." I sat opposite her, holding the journal. "We aren't going to burn these diaries, but we aren't going to put them in the public archive either. We are going to write a new section, a private section. We are going to tell the truth about what happened, but we are going to tell it with compassion. We are going to write Serafina back into the family tree, not as the girl who died, but as the sister who was lost." She stared at me, tears streaming down her face, ruining the perfect mask she had worn for half a century. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" "Because," I said, thinking of my own mistakes, my own failures, the debts I ran from, the loneliness I hid. "Because everyone deserves to be known by their true name before they die." The next 3 months were the most intense of my life. The dynamic in the house shifted completely. The cold employer and the timid archivist vanished. We became conspirators. We became, in a strange way, friends. We spent hours in the library, not just organizing papers, but talking. She told me everything. She told me about the guilt that woke her up at 3 a.m. She told me about the pressure of being Cordelia, of having to suppress every impulse, every laugh, every tear that didn't fit the character. We created a special box, a beautiful mahogany chest lined with velvet. Inside, we placed Serafina's journals, the photos of the twins together, and a new letter. A letter she wrote, with my help, confessing the truth, not for the public, but for the future, for whoever might inherit this house next. She signed it, Serafina Blackwood. It was the first time she had written her own name in 50 years. I saw her hand shake, and then I saw a peace settle over her face that made her look 10 years younger. The storm that had raged outside eventually passed, giving way to a crisp golden autumn. The estate didn't look so ominous anymore. It looked like a place that was finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. When my contract ended, the archives were pristine. The history of the Blackwood family was organized, digitized, and safe. But the real work, the work of healing a fractured soul, was the true accomplishment. On my last day, Serafina, stood by the door to say goodbye. She looked frail. The illness was advancing rapidly now, but her eyes were bright. "You saved me, Genevieve," she said, taking my hand. This time, her grip was warm. "You didn't just save the papers, you saved me." "You saved yourself," I replied. "You finally let yourself exist." She handed me an envelope. "This is your final payment, and a little extra, for the silence and for the kindness." I didn't open it until I was miles away, parked on the side of the road, looking back at the valley where the manor stood. Inside was a check for an amount that made me gasp. It was enough to clear my debts, buy a small house, and start over completely. But wrapped around the check was a note on heavy, cream-colored stationery. "To the Keeper of Secrets, thank you for seeing the girl in the shadows. S." I drove away with tears in my eyes. I had gone there looking for a job, expecting dust and boredom. I left with a secret that weighed heavy on my heart, but it was a good weight, the weight of a truth shared. I never saw her again. 6 months later, I read the obituary in the paper. Cordelia Blackwood, last of the Blackwood line, passed away peacefully as her estate. I went to the funeral. I stood at the back. I listened to the eulogies praising Cordelia's elegance, her stewardship of the estate, her dignity. They spoke of a woman I knew only as a mask. When the service was over and the crowd began to disperse, I walked up to the grave. The tombstone was magnificent marble, Cordelia Blackwood, 1949-2019. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, dried sprig of lavender, the scent of the red trunk. I placed it on the fresh earth. "Goodbye, Serafina," I whispered. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard a voice, light and free, carried on the breeze. A voice that was no longer whispering, no longer hiding. It has been 5 years since that day. I used the money to open a small bookstore and archive consultancy in a quiet coastal town. I deal with old books, lost letters, and family mysteries. Sometimes people come to me with boxes of their grandparents' things, apologizing for the mess. They say, "It's just old paper." I smile at them, put on my white cotton gloves, and say, "There is no such thing as just paper. Every page is a heartbeat. Every letter is a ghost waiting to speak." I often think of that house. I wonder if the next owner found the mahogany chest. I wonder if they read the confession. Or maybe, just maybe, the house is keeping the secret for itself, protecting the memory of the 2 little girls who played in the garden before the world tore them apart. We all have secrets in our workplaces and our families. We all wear masks to survive the day. But I learned something in that dusty library at Blackwood Manor. The truth doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops to be real. Sometimes it just needs one person to listen, one person to witness it. And if you are very lucky, you might find someone who can look past the mask, past the history, past the mistakes, and simply say, "I see you." That is the greatest secret of all. Dear friends, thank you for reading this story. Life is full of hidden rooms and locked trunks. We often judge people by the facade they present, forgetting that behind every difficult boss, every silent neighbor, or every strange relative, there is a story we cannot even imagine. If this story touched you, or if you've ever discovered a secret that changed how you see someone, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you support my work and ensure you never miss a new chapter of our lives. Let's continue to uncover the mysteries of the human heart together. With love, your narrator.